What would you do if you found out that your government had been co-opted by a foreign nation? What if the Chinese, over the past decades, had been sending their agents into our society to infiltrate our institutions of higher education, media, finance, corporations, the military-industrial complex, legal positions as important judges, lobbyists, elected representatives, people on the school boards deciding which textbooks our children are exposed to. If they had been coordinating this kind of mass invasion in order to subvert our national interest and favor their own national interest, do you think you would have a duty to combat this? Would you have a responsibility? Obviously, if they had successfully infiltrated all of these institutions, then they would be able to disseminate propaganda effectively through movies, the news, social media, textbooks, assigned reading in schools, just all the major channels of information that Americans deal with on a day-to-day basis. They would fill those with propaganda that would basically gaslight the American people into never doubting the earnest intention, the goodwill of these Chinese nationals. So, when you found out the truth and you spoke publicly about it, you would be instantly denounced by your former friends, the people you're trying to help. They would mock you. They would say that you are crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist, etc. You might have your finances shut down. Your bank, your Chinese-controlled bank, might deplatform you. Social media might deplatform you. And you would find yourself in a kind of never-ending battle with 1,000 different types of inconvenience that they would put between you and speaking out against what's going on. That's what would happen if you tried to combat their propaganda with your own propaganda. Now, maybe your message is correct, but it's unlikely that you will have found the right talking points to use to combat theirs, because this isn't just some, Xi Jinping or whoever coming up with what they should tell the American people. This is a scientifically engineered system of propaganda. So they use focus groups, they A/B test strategies, they do all of this market research to find out what actually works, whereas you just know what you know the facts, and then you know how you respond to information, but you're an outlier, right? You're the kind of person who does look for your own information, who will change your mind. The average person will simply go with whatever they hear most often. That's just how it is. It's very easy to train the average person in that way. So you relying on your own instincts for what the people need to hear, spreading the truth, you probably won't compete effectively against this scientific strategy. So instead, you might have to act in indirect ways. There are 2 points in this video that I want to get across. First of all, you find yourself in this hypothetical scenario looking for the best strategies for getting your message across, for gradually disseminating your message across society. Now, as a word of warning, if you ever found yourself in this position and you started using some tactics, some narratives, and you ran up to a wall with them, but then you found that the mainstream society had picked up some of these narratives, that should not be a cause, or, an incredulous cause of boosted morale, it is not necessarily a good thing, because a good way of inoculating yourself as a ruling regime against criticism is to find those key points that allow the criticism to have salience in the mind of the public in the first place, and then selectively bring those into, gradually, the public narrative, so that what once seemed to be a truth that was being revealed accidentally becomes this kind of leaked information. And that way, basically, anything that is completely harmful to their agenda can be suppressed, while they don't run into those kind of boiling energies that would simmer under the surface if they simply suppressed all of it. You have to, as a ruling regime, take elements of dissident narratives into the mainstream propaganda. So, hoping that the truth will just gradually disseminate through society ignores the fact that as that truth moves up the chain to larger platforms, more scientifically engineered propaganda vehicles, once the narratives get to that point, they will be spun in subtle ways to once again ultimately benefit the regime interest. So that's, it seems like that would be a hopeful thing, that you see the truth just leaking out. I don't think that's how it works. Instead, you have to think deeper than your opponents. The one thing that a scientifically engineered system of propaganda can't avoid is relying on certain ethical, metaphysical presuppositions and axioms. Right? Inevitably, a statement about values, about the world in general, implicates a metaphysics, implicates a structure of value. The nature of good is implied when you're talking about ethical things. But ordinarily what happens with narratives is people rely on common associations. So like in 2006, you could reliably get a chuckle out of a left-wing person by saying anything bad about George Bush. Not because they were really thinking about the core ethical axioms that underlie that, but because the common association is this guy is bad, or with Trump, orange man bad. That's the kind of thinking that mass propaganda relies on, this kind of by association, loaded terms, connotations. That's how they build in their casuistry into their narratives. But you can always open up another level underneath those surface narratives and ask, why is it that you disapprove of this political figure or this philosophy? You can always get deeper, and once you open up that discourse, they're kind of forced then to come up with some more fundamental philosophical justification. When it comes to the facts, they can always produce false facts. They can always produce misinformation. So exposing the truth in terms of empirical facts is not sufficient, because they can simply create a world of illusions for the people to be trapped in. If you bring it beneath that level, to the underlying metaphysical and ethical axioms that their worldview ultimately relies on, then you can have a kind of level playing field where you can interrogate their position and get people thinking at that deeper level. However, the masses are incapable of thinking at that level. So what you have to rely on then is disseminating this critical discourse regarding mainstream narratives among a competing intellectual elite. And once you're in that position, once again, you have to kind of generate propaganda in some way or another, and you have to ask yourself, what is the best way to accomplish this? Well, now that we've kind of refined what it is we're trying to do, we're trying to create a more comprehensive worldview than our opponents. We're trying to create an intellectual position that is ultimately more defensible. If that's what we're trying to do, then it seems evident that we have to synthesize information from a wide variety of fields. In science, in politics, history, we have to incorporate quite a lot into a comprehensive picture. If you notice, when mass movements really do spread historically, like Islam, like Christianity, they are effective when they have this kind of internal unity. As a worldview, they are coherent with themselves. Now today, you can't really practically deny the credibility of things in science like relativity, like quantum mechanics, like plate tectonics. Like there are a lot of engineerable like things that come out of the sciences that we see on a day-to-day basis, that we use on a day-to-day basis. So any worldview today that has that same potency would have to incorporate what is true in quantum mechanics, in relativity, in modern science. And so going back to like a basic Christianity that ignores all these things is going to leave room for cognitive dissonance on the part of anyone who adopts your attempted alternative worldview. Because on the one hand, they're using all of these tools invented by the scientific technocracy. On the other hand, they're saying like science is bad and truth comes from the Bible. And it's just not a long-term sustainable way of thinking. A certain set of people can be brought into a position like that, but in this day and age, it will not have the scalability of a movement built on a worldview that is coherent with the findings of modern science. So what you need is a discourse where experts from a wide variety of fields come together and discuss how to think interdisciplinarily, I think that's the word, about very broad issues, connecting physics down to metaphysics. Like that has been a tendency in the last 50 years in physics. John Wheeler famously said there is no distinction between physics and metaphysics. Ultimately, it's all talking about the same thing. Not everyone shares that opinion, but like someone like Max Tegmark, at what point does he stop being a physicist and begin being a metaphysicist? It's very unclear. And so uniting physics with metaphysics, uniting metaphysics with ethics via the science of consciousness, which is one of those kind of cutting-edge things in modern science that people are interested in neuroscience, in philosophy of mind, in different fields. And I follow the kind of people who talk about these issues, and there seems to be a potential for some kind of grand synthesis of physics, metaphysics, consciousness, and therefore ethics and everything else down the line. Nobody has it yet. But to get to that point, you have to build an open discourse. The thing to avoid here is having individual topic experts try to create their own little fiefdoms, where they get remunerated for their research, for their public communications, and they use that to fuel their individual lifestyle. And what are the incentives in that? As long as these people can pay their bills, they will only work so hard as their passion leads them to work. And for many people, that is an intense thing. But your passion does not always lead you to intellectual honesty. Often it leads you to nurse your pet theories instead of engaging with other public intellectuals in a way that gets to the root of some of these disagreements that are often difficult to suss out. So individual actors, intellectual figures, run into these incentive problems. It's hard for them to remain objective. It's hard to incentivize them to look at the work of their rivals. I've seen, there are streams out there where they interview modern physicists, modern philosophers talking about these sorts of issues, and often they'll ask, what do you think of this other thinker's work, and they'll say, I really should have read it, but I actually haven't looked at it. That's what you run into. That's predictable just by human nature. We're egoistic. We believe too hard in our own theories, and we don't want to think about what other people out there have to say. So you're not going to build a discourse, an effective discourse, unless you get these people together somehow where they are incentivized to communicate their ideas to one another. One way of doing that is gamifying the discourse and creating explicit monetary incentives in association with, across the aisle communication. To a degree, that already happens, where, if two public intellectuals have a stream together that builds their brands individually, they get more viewers, more donations potentially. But the incentive on each of their part will be to be diplomatic, not to be really earnestly seeking the truth, but trying to make strategic alliances with other content creators that will be mutually beneficial. Beneficial in terms of these kind of instinctual drives to I want to have status, I want to pay my bills, I want this and that, fame, whatever it is. That's a very real problem that in a lot of ways is the reason in our hypothetical scenario that the Chinese would have been able to invade and take over our society, because our political class wasn't acting cohesively. They were self-interested individually. They were incentivized to come together, resolve their differences. They were incentivized by the structure of public discourse to create these camps, these fiefdoms, and get their supporters financially supporting them. What you need is incentives to create a network of information that continually circulates and processes all of these ideas, so that basically you can just kind of churn up all of the ideas that are out there that are important and get this one homogeneous thing that comes out at the other end, and that's your worldview. That's what you need. And honestly, what is the best way of doing that? Why do these individual content creators want to get their individual income? So that they can pay their individual bills. It is the way that we're living, right? It's not the way our ancestors lived. Our ancestors lived in villages where the people in the village met the needs of each other. Now we have reliance on global supply chains, which are, by the way, completely fragile. They could collapse at any moment for a variety of reasons. So we're dependent on this international system that looks like it's pretty unstable. Which is probably not good, but anyway, our ancestors lived together. They were accountable to one another morally because they saw each other day to day. You couldn't be a drug addict or a drunk and get away with it. People would know what you were doing. They would call you a drunkard. You'd be called out on your bad behavior, on your vices, because you were together. That's the way we evolved to be. So the way that we live now, kind of partitioned off in these individual units, is not healthy. It's not the way we evolved to act, and you shouldn't expect that someone is going to operate at peak efficiency under those circumstances. You should put people in an environment that they are adapted to. We are adapted to be in small communities. So, if somehow you could get a group of intellectuals together into a village where they're living together, they would be incentivized to share their thought before the entire community, everyone who is there, instead of looking off into internet land and finding their niche audience that will support them, right? Some of that could still exist if they were located together, but day to day, who they interact with, they're going to be thinking about those other intellectuals, the other people that they need to actually work out these differences with. So once you had that, then it reduces expenses. It's much cheaper to house several people in one homestead than a bunch of people in individual suburban housing units. Much, much cheaper. So from the standpoint of the audience, let's say, people who don't consider themselves content creators or public intellectuals, people who just want to see what's happening in these spaces, those people, if they want to support these public intellectuals, and I think that's a good thing, that you should support this so that it's not just system propaganda dominating everything. You have to incentivize dissident voices. But anyway, from the standpoint of the audience, would it be better to donate money to individuals who are basically blowing the majority of that money on rent, probably, their individual expenses, where they're buying food that is probably GMO, it's probably got pesticides on it, probably, they're eating the wrong kinds of food because, they're not living with a nutritionist. Would it be better to give your money to one guy who's going to blow it in the way that everyone today blows their money because our lifestyle is highly inefficient and it's not healthy? Or would it be better to donate to a community where you're supporting 20, 30 public intellectuals who maybe you have a nutritionist there, maybe they are growing their own food, maybe they found ways of saving money and, organizing their discourse more effectively? Would that be better? If you are the community of people who are against the Chinese takeover of your society, would you want to support a bunch of individual actors who are each individually egoistically motivated to keep their little media fiefdoms on platforms that are controllable by the Chinese? Or do you want to, as that dissident community, support a project like a whole community, where a real revolutionary worldview could be born and then disseminated organically, simply because it is more correct? And again, not just factually more correct. You can't operate at the domain of facts, because facts, it's possible that they might have moral implications, depending on what positions you take philosophically. Some people would say there's an is-ought gap. If you buy that, then you can't determine what we should do as a nation by sharing the relevant facts. You could tell people about the statistics on Chinese crime, nepotism, collusion, whatever it is that the Chinese are doing that you don't like. You could share those statistics and someone could just come up with a narrative why, well, it's not their fault, or it's actually a good thing. It's what it means for us politically does not necessarily follow from those facts. So you need a more comprehensive worldview to really have that persuasive thrust. So there's 2 points I wanted to get across in this video. One, if you're going to have a dissident intellectual community, it is obviously way more efficient to have a dissident community come together that is open to entry, where people can be accountable, where people can live a healthy lifestyle, where people are incentivized to share their ideas with others, to make that as easy as possible, to make it as resilient as possible. That's obviously better. Okay, I don't know who's still fighting an idea like this. It seems pretty clear that if you want to fight the Chinese off, you're much better off doing that than supporting a bunch of individual YouTube channels. Second, you need a whole worldview. You need metaphysics in order to combat political narratives that you don't like, if they're dominant, right? If they have the superior communication technology, superior propaganda, the only place you can fight them is at the bottom of their worldview, to bring it down to first principles and then show why your first principles are superior. That's not an easy task, but it's been done successfully. Radical new worldviews have come out and swept across the known world and led to massive political change. It can happen again, right? And there's very little that a dominant technocratic regime can do against that possibility. Mainly, they bank on the fact that no one's going to come up with the new Islam. No one's going to come up with the new Christianity. I'm not saying it has to be a religion, but this is just the sociological function of what I'm talking about, which is a radical new worldview, which basically sidesteps and cuts under all of the mainstream propaganda narratives, renders them moot, basically. Don't directly challenge them, right? Just go completely underneath them, and even get to the point where you do have engineerable practical outcomes of your system, where you can build better communities, build better farms, build better lifestyles, build something that they can't, technologies that they can't build. And people will see that and say, okay, obviously they have something. And that's when you win the average person over. You don't win the average person over by going out into the streets and chanting, the Chinese will not replace us. That can't work. Individuals online basically doing the same thing is not much better. There is one right answer to this question. How do you deal with the subversion of your nation? When you don't control the means of communication, you don't control those technologies, you can control how and where you live. And if you can get together with other intellectuals and live in the healthiest way possible and sacrifice your individual comfort in search of a greater good, then there is this possibility. There is something that can be done. Now, if you find yourself in that position where the future of your country is being taken away, do you have an obligation to sacrifice your comfort and challenge yourself and go after whatever shot there is of overcoming the current situation? Do you have to go for it? I think you do. I don't think you should expect to defeat an enemy who has been mounting their forces over generations with billions of dollars backing them. I don't think you can expect to defeat them by just living your life as usual. I think you're going to have to get together with others and do something radical. If you were going to have an armed revolution, you would have to do that. You would have to get together and train. Like jihadists in the Middle East have to do that. When the CIA goes in to create some new Wahhabist strain of radical Islam, they create camps where these people go and train day to day. It's pretty basic, really. You need the madrasa, you need the monastery. This is a tried and true method of creating institutional change. Similar to a think tank, but a think tank, you kind of go 9 to 5 and you go home. You can't really build that fundamental new worldview that's needed unless you're living with people and seeing the consequences of their thought and integrating from the level of physiology, emotional communication, ethics of cohabitation, actually dealing with those issues of living in community that you have to deal with, and then going beyond that into intellectual consensus. All of these layers of communication and cooperation have to be integrated to build something that's going to be truly scalable, resilient, potent. You want it to be concentrated. So you need to concentrate your forces into one. It's cheaper, and it's the only way to really get to those bottom level presuppositions that you have to challenge in order to undermine the political narratives of your enemy. That's what you would do if you found yourself in a situation like that where a foreign nation had taken over your institutions. Luckily, that's pure fiction. We don't have to worry about that. But if you ever find yourself in that position, take these thoughts into consideration. Thank you guys for listening. God bless.